here again. Back-to-back interviews with two of the handsomest guys I ever knew and smartest. And this time we are shifting over to my bro and very special pal and one of the people I admire most, Stanley Robinson. We got to know each other when we were both students of Ursula Le Guin's back at UCSD. He was getting his doctorate in English literature, I believe. He went on to, I was stuck doing physics. He went on to at least once rob me of a Hugo, but no grudges, no grudges. What Stan Robinson is absolute proof that there exist truly professional science fiction authors, unlike dilettantes like me. And you don't have to be a scientist to do hard scientific science fiction. There are other examples, Greg Bear, Nancy Kress, some of the greatest, truly extrapolative, based on reality, exploratory science fiction is done by former English majors, because they understand the notion of how to get the information you need in order to make a plausible, sometimes scarily plausible, story about human destiny that could possibly change our course. Now, mostly we'll be concentrating on Stan's most famous and most lauded subgenre, which is cli-fi or climate fiction. But first off, Stan, hello, and then I want to talk briefly about non-climate sci-fi. So yes. Hello and welcome to FIRE.
Well, thank you, David. Good to see you. Good to see everybody. I wish it was in person, as I know a lot of us do, but we'll get back to that someday. And David, it's been too long, partly because I think COVID, but because I'm often in San Diego, where David is nearby. So that'll happen again. And meanwhile, it's fun to see you on the screen. So thank you.
Well, Stan lives in Hobbitown in Davis, California. What is it? Village Homes? Or
Village Homes is a little kind of hippie suburbia of the 1970s, where all the street names are. I'm on Ellendale. There's also Bombadil and Oakenshield, and the street names predate the movies. They're from the 70s. It's a great neighborhood. I'm currently back on the board of directors, which let's not talk about that, because I'm trying to save a preschool that died before I got on and complicates my project quite a bit.
And as kids are singing all these songs, let's talk about Bruno. Let's not talk about all the people in Village Homes who live on Mordor Lane. So anyway, I wanted to mention, of course, we're going to be talking a lot about your cli-fi, your climate science fiction, but I do want to mention Aurora and Red Moon, which you make some very strong points about space travel. Now, you've taken your readers all over the solar system, and then in Aurora, you probably got more hate mail from that book than any of your other books, because it says, you wanted me to go interstellar, I'll go interstellar once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I did get hammered for that one, but then again, I took like a model of the USS Enterprise from Star Trek and smashed it with a baseball bat in a single novel. And it turns out that the cosmism, or the idea that humanity is going to the stars, is a kind of a religious position. So I was an iconoclast in the literal sense that I broke the icon. I don't think it's possible, for various reasons we don't need to go into, having to do mostly with distance, but also with physiology and sociology, and on it went. It was a case, as David said, it's a novel with a point to it. And I was thinking, yeah, as opposed to all those pointless novels, of which there are many. So yes, it was a case novel trying to show we can't get to the stars. And so we better focus on, for sure, the solar system, which I love still. And, Red Moon that you mentioned, we're going to be going to the moon like it's at the end of a plane trip. That's easy. Mars is complicated but interesting. The rest of the solar system is our neighborhood and is of huge interest, and it's lovely. So I'm not anti-space. I'm just saying we're not going to the stars, not individual human bodies.
Yeah, well, we've both written about robotics being and whether or not whether or not such entities might essentially be our heirs when it comes to such things. Now, the Ministry of I almost said Ministry of Truth, Ministry for the Future has been a huge hit, especially in this transformation that we've seen in attitudes by the New York and other literary review communities. Literary communities have just really taken to it for good reason, because it explores, as did 2312, as did New York 2140, and to some degree your Mars series. And certainly the Capital series, which dealt with the argumentations of politics of climate, 40 signs of rain, 50 degrees below, and 60 days and counting. You are, I mean, I had a novel called Earth, but you have certainly made the notion that Earth is a character in your works, very much emblematic of Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer.
Well, I'd like to think that I'm a Martian and the solar system is my neighborhood, as I said, but Earth is always the center of the human story. So, and science fiction has a long tradition there. One thing I want to say about Ministry for the Future that I only recently figured out about it was I would divide our science fiction genre. One of the ways of dividing it is by far future, near future, and the interesting in between. So far future is basically space opera, zipping around the galaxy, if not more, maybe millions of years in the future. And it's that Clarkian technology magic. It's a form of fantasy literature in a way. And many great novels have been written in the far future. So I'm not putting it down, but it exists as a fantasy space. Then there's near future science fiction, which is really day after tomorrow. It's a way of talking about the present where you emphasize a few aspects and foreground them and say, look, this is coming fast, it's going to dominate. And near future science fiction is a way of talking about the present with a certain edge, trajectory, accuracy. And I think it's the best realism of our time. And it leaves literary fiction in the dust as being a description of our society today. But think about a century out, 2 centuries out, 3 centuries out. That is relatively depopulate in the literature. There are very much fewer science fiction novels set in that zone. And I've often gone there because you can talk about it as it's not quite a realism anymore. You make speculations as to what would occur that have to be speculative. Like in 2312, I felt like I was at the end of my rope, as far out as my tether goes into the future, but my Mars novels are a century or 2 out by the time they're done. So what I want to say about Ministry for the Future was I took what you can do in that middle zone, which I call future history, and I enjammed it into the near future scenario, basically saying starting now and in the next 30 years, we're going to have a century's worth of stuff happen. And not only that, but my dates in Ministry for the Future are all wrong. Things that I said happening in the 2030s or the 2040s are actually happening now or are going to happen in the next few years. So you have to remember, I wrote this book in 2019, a much darker time for a couple of reasons. It looked like Trump might win a re-election. And also the pandemic had not yet slapped us in the face and taught us how quickly things can change and how much we're involved with this biosphere. So that now we're paying attention to climate change in a way that we didn't before the pandemic. So this is why I think why Ministry for the Future has gotten broad attention is actually a science fiction trick. Jam your future history novel into the present and see if it, and I think that's one of the things that has made people pay attention to it.
Well, that's one of the things that we've always agreed upon is these 3 time zones. We don't necessarily agree upon where the boundaries are to the 3 time zones. When I wrote Earth back in 1990, 2038 was very much intermediate.
Absolutely.
And I set existence in 2038, writing it 20 years later, because it takes into account the fact that this wall of future is really, really coming at us very, very fast.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is kind of fluid boundaries stuff. Even far future science fiction is often easily transcodable to being about current issues. Ian Banks is very good at this, Ken MacLeod. It's not as if far future science fiction or space opera is escapist. It can be allegory and be about things going on right now. So I was trying, there's several things about Ministry for the Future that have been so startling since it came out, mind-boggling for me to witness, that I've been trying to account for it. Like, why did it happen? And there's the idea of a coherent, that no matter the messiness, that the future could turn out well. That's important. That's a story that hasn't been told enough. That you could set a new bar for utopia. You could say that if we dodge a mass extinction event, that's a utopian science fiction story now. The bar has been lowered, but you don't want to go lower than that, or you get into the inability to get to a good space through this next period of time. And then the other thing I think going on here is the carbon coin, that there is content. The novum in Ministry for the Future is a financial instrument that allows us to pay ourselves for doing the right things instead of continuing to pay ourselves for doing the wrong things. And that's clearly hit a nerve or fulfilled a hunger. People wanted that story. The central banks themselves are discussing it. And so it's not, thank God, it's not just a science fiction writer's idea, but is in the discussion as to how to go forward and dodge this mass extinction event. So these are various reasons why I think Ministry has been a hit and gotten discussed. I would reckon easily a magnitude scale beyond any previous book of mine, and I thought I had been doing fine before, but something's different about this one in terms of the general culture.
Well, your doctoral supervisor, Frederick Jameson, who I know, he wrote something that I think you've quoted several times, is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And yet you imagine, what's very interesting is that you and I probably have voted the same all our lives, and we're actually very pragmatically about this civilization, totally in agreement. And yet we often have knockdowns over vocabulary. So in your case, however, you make serious efforts to imagine alternatives to capitalism as we know it. And I add the last part because that's where I agree with you.
Well, I want to say that, first of all, we're in a climate change emergency such that my theories about what would be just in the world are semi-irrelevant. We are in a capitalist world right now, and we need to dodge the mass extinction event. The immense power of private capital has to be brought to bear. So then it becomes a matter of defining the highest rate of return and channeling the huge forces of private capital into doing good things for the environment. If they were to get paid for it by a carbon coin, that's good, that's central banking. But on the other hand, if asset managers were convinced that going long and going for biosphere health was the better investment than short-term extraction and destruction, then you've got win-win across this economy. So although I'm an old hippie Vietnam era radical trained by Fred Jameson, a democratic socialist, blah, 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 this is irrelevant to the current crisis, which is a question of aiming capital as by way of government intervention and by way of individual decisions, by way of asset managers and individual investors all across the board to go green. And I saw this in Glasgow very, very clearly. I had 38 events in 12 days, and I said yes to anybody who wanted me to talk. And I come in as a Keynesian thinking, look, the government just has to seize the economy. Like in World War II, the way the British Treasury said to the Bank of England, sorry, you're working for us now, and you're no longer a semi-autonomous unit. You are part of the British effort for the war. I think we need some moves like that are MMT or that are Keynesian in basis, where the government pushes hard and leads the way, including its central banks. But what I saw in Glasgow were any number of, I'm talking about dozens of groups of various kinds of investment capital, and not just venture capital, but asset managers. In fact, I sat down at a table, I was starving, there was a half-finished pizza there. I said to my Chinese host, who was head of World Wildlife Fund in China, can I eat this pizza? And he just cracks up, because it was cold, half there. He goes, yeah, you can eat it. That's Larry Fink's pizza. So I was scamming on Larry Fink's pizza because he was there too. And what I'm saying is, in an all hands on deck situation, one's political, you don't want to get into the narcissism of small differences. Like say I'm a democratic socialist and you're a social democrat. Who cares? I mean, really, this is like so irrelevant in the crisis that we're in. It needs to be a united front, and we need to aim all of our resources, from private to public to shared to philanthropic, which is another important element, and they all have to be aimed at this. So I came out of Glasgow stunned and reeling, and also with laryngitis. I couldn't talk, I couldn't think. It actually took me a month or two to recover from Glasgow. It was the first COP I'd ever been to. And clearly it blew my mind. But I was thinking to myself, let's not be a stickler for the way we want the world to be 300 years from now in terms of its political economy. Let's think about what can we do right now because we're coming so close to planetary boundaries, and everybody here knows this, so I won't go on about it. But if we cross some of these planetary boundaries, we cannot pay our way out of it. We can't claw back. There's nothing humans can do after we've crossed certain of these boundaries. We're just stuck with hothouse Earth and a mass catastrophe. So in the all hands on deck situation, I am probably much more open-minded than I was even 6 months ago, even when I wrote Ministry for the Future, where I was trying to work out all this stuff and left certain big pieces out of the story. And that happens when you write a novel, but it's been an overwhelming 3 years since I wrote that book.
Well, the possibility of a nonlinear acceleration of the things we see is exemplified by the hydrate clathorates, methane clathorates
Absolutely.
Under the ocean or in the tundra in
Yes.
Siberia. And these are things that could take off,
Yes.
leaving us only with the possibility of true interventions, not just slowing down the rate of emissions, but also some degree of geoengineering. And you've been exploring that, for instance, having to do with pumping out meltwater under glaciers. I touched on that briefly in Earth. I also touched on the notion that of ocean fertilization, because whales prosper where there's a lot of krill, and we could maybe stir the ocean bottoms and create more of those zones. What do you think of, in what rank order would you say that if we had a real emergency, we could do some good with geoengineering?
Well, I'm interested in all of them, David. And of course, the ones that don't seem to have any downside whatsoever seem to me to be no-brainers. If we could slow the glaciers in Antarctica and Greenland back to their historic speeds by pumping out the meltwater beneath them, that is a big if. That would have to be tested. But if we could do it and took away off the table the problem of rapid sea level rise wrecking the coastlines, not to mention drowning all the beaches, which would be sad for me personally, but wrecking seaports, that would be a great thing. And I think the oil industry could be providing the pumps, and instead of pumping out oil, they're pumping out water from below ice. And then the navies of the world that are all sitting ducks at this point in world history, if they became logistical support for that kind of an effort down there with aircraft carriers and helicopters and icebreakers, international effort to stabilize glaciers. I just wrote a column about this for Bloomberg Green. It'll be in the next Bloomberg green. Sir David King, who is now at Cambridge University thinking about these kind of issues, and János Pastor, who a Hungarian living in Switzerland, he worked in the UN most of his career. They're working on governance of geoengineering efforts, like how do we decide what to do and try to make it truly international. Yeah, Sir Dave says you don't need to stir the ocean bottom, which is probably bad, but what you do is you create an artificial concoction that it imitates the chemical composition of whale poop, because there's only 1% the whales that there were, and it turns out they were crucial. So they eat low, they poop high. It's a biopump. You can help the oceans, and that's geoengineering, really, or else it's just wildlife assistance. God knows. The one problem is this term geoengineering. It looks like there's a knee-jerk reaction against it by my colleagues and companions on the left of the 1970s, the left of the 1990s. To a certain extent, they haven't got up to the moment of the crisis. And also environmentalists. Oh my God, it's a moral hazard. Oh my God, rich people will try to get away with doing what they're doing. No, in the all hands on deck situation, even cutting carbon emissions as fast as we possibly can, we might still need to do some of these geoengineering things. And so that brings up the big one, solar radiation management. Do we cast dust into the atmosphere? Maybe. I mean, if we get too hot and people are dying of wet bulb 35 temperatures, a single country, as in my novel where India does it, or an international agreement to do it, but it wouldn't be sulfur dioxide. This is something that comes out of Pinatubo and out of volcanoes. It works, but it also destroys the ozone layer. So what you would want is limestone dust, something inert, and it would have the same reflective effect without wrecking the ozone layer. And the thing is, there is no termination shock. 5 years later, that dust has fallen back to the ground. You've gone back to the way it was before. At that point, you look at what you got. You look at the data. Did the monsoon get messed up? Did temperatures drop, and where and for how long? And then you could decide whether you needed to do it again on an on-demand basis. Are people dying of wet bulb temperatures? Should we ought to lower the temperature for another 5 years and see what we get? So yes, this is, I think, in fact, us as science fiction writers, and again, it doesn't matter that I'm an American leftist and a green and all this stuff. That my crowd is behind the curve of necessity on these issues, that we may have to consider all these things. It's an all hand on deck moment, and everything needs to be on the table, including, I must add, nuclear power. There was a group at Glasgow talking about thorium-based small nuclear power plants that were, the power units were regularized, so they only needed to get one approval from an international committee. And then they were even proposing to plug them into coal-fired power plants, take out the coal, put in a thorium nuclear reactor, use the same infrastructure to create the energy, and use the same employment force to keep their jobs. And instead of just decommissioning a massive infrastructure of coal-powered energy plants, suddenly they're being powered by these tiny little new, safer thorium nuclear reactors. So heck, go nukes, you know, I mean, at this point, it's all hands on deck.
There's always been a wing of the liberal community, the techno hippies. Stuart Brand has been talking nuclear for a very long time. He's a friend of both of ours.
Yes.
You get to see him more often. Say hi to him, and
I saw him last night. So I
say hi for us. The thing is, you see that well, in my opinion, we can't afford civil wars among those who are in the coalition who accept facts. And what you've just done is destroyed my image that you and I agree about absolutely everything except vocabulary. I mean, that's been demolished too. So I don't know what to do. In any event, I have to declare independence from you a bit. May I point out also that all right, I'm yours.
We're just teammates.
We're teammates. The one thing that needs to be hammered is that among the world places that are most likely to be victim by climate change is the southeastern United States, not only because of rising tides, but also because of the ecological effects, which are just going to devastate the southeastern US. And the fact that the polemicists appealing to that region in particular don't care is, I believe, where the real schism is taking place. Now let's veer over to science fiction and literary style, because of course
Sure.
you have long had the ability to relate fascinating characters in a multiple point of view style that's very, very powerfully more frequent in science fiction. And but in Ministry for the Future, you seem to go full in on what I sometimes call the Stand on Zanzibar style. It's John Brunner, John Dos Passos, USA. You're a literary scholar, so you can probably name earlier examples, and that is where the author creates a bouillabaisse of scenes with chunks of different, some of them just brief glimpses of the world that you're portraying.
Yep. That I think Dos Passos invented that true bouillabaisse, which is a good description of it, in his USA trilogy, which I recommend to all of you. The America in the 1920s has never been portrayed better. And the novel, first of all, it needs to be about characters. It's designed to talk about the individual in their family, in their community, and maybe in their society. And it's good at that. And that's the 19th century tradition. And then what science fiction brings is the relationship to the planet and to long-term history. So I regard our genre science fiction as being supercharged, but it does lead a technical problem. How do you still keep the individual in it? And going straight from the individual to the planet is a little bit hard. So the Dos Passos method of having a strand of newspaper clippings that Brunner picked up for Stand on Zanzibar and made science fiction aware of it as a method. I used it explicitly in 2312, right down to the same fonts as in the USA trilogy. The table of contents in 2312 is a kind of an homage. In Ministry for the Future, I did the same thing, and I included the it narrative of the 18th century, where a coin would tell its story or a violin would tell its story. Also riddles from ancient Anglo-Saxon. About a third of remaining Anglo-Saxon literature is made of riddles, and we don't know what the answers were supposed to be. And also meeting notes and radio dialogues and the whole thing. But the crucial one was the eyewitness account, which again, I think you were referring to. The eyewitness account is not the same as novelization. You don't set the table. You don't say, I got up that morning and I had breakfast and my dog barked and all that. The way that dramatization works, which I believe in as much as any other novelist, nevertheless, it isn't what the eyewitness account is about, where someone is being asked about something, usually it happened 10 or 20 years previous to them. They saw a piece of history, they tell you about it, so it's telling rather than showing, which I love. And in telling it, they judge it. They say it's meaning for them and for the world. And these collections of eyewitness accounts, I was reading them and they were blowing my mind. They're so fast, they're so propulsive, they're so judgmental, and it's a beautiful form. And the novel can indeed suck in all other forms. So in Ministry, I would say there's probably 20 to 30 eyewitness accounts, and I'm as proud of them. They're fictional, of course, because they take place in the future. What happens when your town runs out of water? What happens when there's a riot? What happens when you get thrown into a refugee camp? These eyewitnesses, I'm as proud of them as anything that I ever wrote, because I was kind of channeling other voices and getting away from your ordinary dramatized scene, which is fine as far as it goes, because we want to immerse ourselves in a daily life somewhere else in someone else's head. But the eyewitness account was another reason I think that Ministry succeeded in catching people's attention. There's a lot of people talking in that book. And I tried to get out of the way. And I would say that the middle part of 2019 was one of the most beautiful writing experiences of my life. For 3 or 4 months there, I was just getting out of the way and people were talking. So this is really what novels are all about, I think.
Yeah, some of my own favorites, second of course to yours, but some of my own favorites of my own are try for that. I'm not sure I succeed as well. I'd like to drop back a little bit, though, and talk about something that I think, again, we'll probably agree about violently. And that was, well, I'm going to quote from a little something here. Karl Popper had a rather scathing critique of Hegel and Marx based on the point, a syndrome which he later labeled historicism, the false belief that history has a recognizable pattern and that future events are determined by and can be predicted using understanding of that pattern. He spoke of this in The Open Society and Its Enemies. Now, you had a line in Blue Mars: there is no such thing as historical determinism, but only people's repeated efforts to enact their hopes. Then the analyst's retroactive recognition of such hopes as came true created an illusion of determinism.
Yeah, I would stick by that. There is no historical determinism. And I would say that as much as I love Karl Marx's insightful analysis of the history of the world up to his time, including its economic fundamentals and his goal of ultimate equality amongst human beings, all admirable. I grew up in the Marxist tradition, working under Fred Jemison. When he spoke of the future, he was a science fiction writer, like any other person speaking of the future. And as a science fiction writer, he's doomed to be wrong, because all science fiction writers are wrong when they try to predict the future. It's a modeling exercise. And so that model didn't work. There's a really good book by Hayden White called Meta History, where he points out that all the great historical theories seem to go back to basic myths, like there was a golden age and then we fell, or we began as ignorant barbarians, very much like chimpanzees, and then we kept rising forever and things have been getting better and better. And so what he was pointing out was that as sophisticated as historians seem to look, when they got to their basic patterns, they were the utmost simplest stories ever told from back in the beginning. It's a devastating critique, meta history, and quite hilarious, because you can never deny it. So one thing historians did was they became the analysts. They began to go back into the records. What did ordinary people do? They gave up on the great macro histories of pattern. They went to, well, this happened and then that happened. It was more contingent. It was more materialist. Like, did it matter when trade was cut off and people ran out of one material good or another in the Mediterranean? Braudel is particularly good amongst the analysts for giving granular history rather than grand theorization. And every once in a while, grand theorization will come back, because I think it's maybe not Popper, but Popel, which is, I gotta say, a confusion I've never gotten over amongst these philosophers who made up the word monocausotaxophilia, the love of single causes that explain everything. And we all are very prone to monocausotaxophilia, all of us. But the moment that you look at the diagram of a protein, or you look at one of these satellite photos of the night sky, you realize that is a category error to think there's a single cause that explains everything in history, in the world. That always wrong. It's really complex. There's more to the story, and it seems to me to be fractal in terms of explanations, that they just keep getting bigger and smaller as you push it both ends of the scale.
Yeah, again, agreeing violently. Karl Marx, I believe, was one of the world's greatest science fiction authors, not only because he made plausible tales about the future that did not happen, but he arguably caused them not to happen. In my, I have a little book recently about science fiction in Hollywood, arguing that Hollywood science fiction saved all our lives. And in it, I have a side riff about how those who read Marx prevent it from happening. Those who ignore Marx are inviting it to happen.
Well, a future society where everybody had a dignity and equal amounts of power and had adequacy, and there was a wage ratio that went from 1 to 10, as in the US Navy, that would be a consummation devoutly to be wished. In other words, there are political orders, some are better than others. And what Marx was groping towards from his mid-19th century perspective was an attempt to deal with the suffering and inequality of early industrial society. All good. I'm not a Marxist, but I'm a fellow traveler and I'm a leftist. I like him. But on the other hand, it's now the year 2022, and there have been so many new things have happened, so many things that were unimaginable in the 19th century that you can use thinkers like him as a guidepost. But let's not get caught up on a single thinker, because it's been such a flashpoint in American history. People, oh, let's beat up on Marx, or let's defend Marx. Let's forget about Marx right now. It's been useful in its time, but there's more to talk about that is, I think, more interesting. And speaking of science fiction writers in the future, this is somewhat of a joke, but you know how in quantum mechanics, there's the Pauli exclusion theory that essentially I don't want to blow this too badly, but two quantum particles like photons cannot occupy the same space. They have to be separated by 10 to the negative 34th of a centimeter.
If they're fermions, bosons don't mind great big group hugs.
Well, good. But what I'm saying is that if you tell a science fiction story, that's not going to happen in the future by a kind of historiographical Pauli exclusion. You cannot possibly predict what's really going to happen. And if you predict something, you know what you know for sure is that particular prediction is not going to happen. But this is just a joke.
Yeah. I just wanted to finish this up by saying that, you know, it has appeared to me, and I've written about this online, that the notion of cyclical patterns being something that is very much beloved, it appears to be a trait of the right, and the left has a tendency to see things instead as accumulative in some way, in some direction. Although then you risk teleology in both cases, and in both cases, of course, teleology is monocausal. I'm sorry, what? Monocausal.
Oh, taxophilic.
Taxophily. Okay, I gotta write that one down.
Yeah, but yes, I think that history, there are trajectories, there are trends. It's just that there are too many of them, and the logistical curve, the big S, comes into play in ways that we can't usefully describe where the steep steep incline upward is going to level off in some asymptotic way. So it's entirely pointless to try to predict. It's too contingent. Fred Pohl, a friend of ours, had an early novel called Drunkard's Walk, which was a statistical term for just a crazy meandering across the landscape. It's not quite that random history, because people keep trying to do things. But in a way, right now, theories of history, what we've got is we're in a crisis. And there's a peculiarity, and I wanted you to contemplate. Is this an artifact of our perception and a kind of a cognitive error, or is this one of the most important decades in all of human history, and indeed Earth history? Because when you say, well, in fact it is, it's a critical decade in human history and in geological time because of the possibility of a sixth great mass extinction event. Isn't that weird? Doesn't that contradict the principle of mediocrity that says we should not be special? And maybe we're just thinking it is, like, oh my God, we're in the crisis of all crises. I can't quite decide about that one, but it feels like this is a critical decade in human history, because we got to get a grip before we crash the biosphere. Because crashing the biosphere will crash civilization. It won't render humans extinct. There will be little groups of people doing some survivalist type activities, and we're so clever, so high tech that the worry is not human extinction. It's the crash of civilization and the resulting disasters, which could indeed include, the death of. You could get down to I mean, I hate to say this, it's so ridiculous, but you could get down to very few humans compared to what we got now if civilization crashes. And if the biosphere crashes, civilization goes. So in that kind of an emergency, it seems to me that the whole focus of something like fire and everything else we do should be, how can we quickly scale the good things? How can we quickly get rid of the bad things? For carbon, for biodiversity. And there were already 5 things that if we agreed to do them and pay for them and convince the rest of our fellow citizens that these are things that are crucially important, that would go a long way to saving the day. And it only has to happen in the G20 for it to be influential everywhere else. I mean, more than influential, determinative. So we got a big problem. We got certain obvious solutions. So it's at this point, many other discussions become kind of hyper theoretical.
Well, except for the one, and we're experiencing that in geopolitics as we speak.
True.
In tragic ways. And that is what I consider to be a worldwide, I think, desperate push to reestablish traditional historical 99% of human history pyramidal structures of control. And these are rooted in the way males' reproductive strategy is all across mammalia, is to across feudalism, 99% of human history, and that is to screw the Commonwealth for the sake of my own reproductive success. I take heart in the desperate levels of that this push is being pursued, because it seems desperate. It seems as if they know this is their last chance.
There's some desperate thrashing and flailing going on, and it looks so stupid that you realize that these are Putin in particular at the end of some kind of rope. Let me bring up another thing that I think fire would be perfect to try to discuss in the future: the problem of the petrostates. Understand that we got 3,500 gigatons of fossil fuels identified. Understand that only 500 can be burned. 3,000 gigatons need to stay in the ground. And there are petrostates where 60 to 80% of their income comes from selling fossil fuels for burning elsewhere. And this is not just Russia, although they're the biggest and the most dangerous, but also Nigeria, Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, Canada, Australia, South Africa. It goes on and on. The petrostates, and remember again, because most of you probably know this, only 25% of the fossil fuels are owned by private corporations. The other 75% are under national control of national companies. They're nation state assets, and those petrostates are screwed doubly, because if you depend on 60 to 80% of your income coming from the sale of fossil fuels, it doesn't matter if you're a kleptocrat or if you're a beautiful, altruistic, democratic politician. Either way, you're not going to be able to do government services like schools, air traffic controllers, roads, police, and not to mention military, of course. So they're looking down the barrel, the petrostates, of bankruptcy and social collapse and becoming a failed state. We have failed states: Somalia, Syria. Russia cannot be a failed state. As happy as it would make old anti-communists or whatever, the anti-Russian feeling is strong or weak, who cares? But they're too big and dangerous to become a failed state. And about 2 billion of the people on this planet are in petrostates, and they don't have an exit strategy. So here's a challenge for fire. I know you guys are good at this. How do we compensate the petrostates without causing squawks on all sides? Because it'll look like paying off an extortionist. Like, I got a bomb tied to my chest, pay me or I'll blow myself up, and you too. It'll also look to the petrostates like their sovereignty is being overtaken. Like, if we give them money to keep it in the ground, as they say, then we're going to have it entailed. Like, we give you this money, you've taken a haircut, it's going to be amortized over a century. We will give it to you, the world community, but it's going to be entailed such that you have to spend it on decarbonization, and you have to give it to your people, not to your kleptocrats. And the kleptocrats are going to say, wait, that's an attack on our sovereignty. And you're going to have to go from being sovereign nation states to semi-sovereign member states. And the difference between a sovereign state and a member state is crucially different in mindset and even in law. And so this compensating of the petrostates, I calculate the value of what has to stay in the ground as if it were oil today. And this is, of course, channeling a kind of a, this is a Mark Anderson trick to think about things in quantitative and cognitive terms. But one time I calculated, just using the price of a barrel of oil, it was $1,600 trillion. That has to stay in the ground. That's a lot of money. On the other hand, the world economy trades around like $75 trillion a year. So say it's 10 years of the world economy. Well, okay, that's big, but it's not infinity either. And it could be amortized and it could be discounted. So I'm just saying there's a need for a plan here so that the world doesn't blow up over the petrostates dragging their heels, burning their carbon, selling it, or being good guys and going bankrupt and having their societies collapse. When you've got the horns of a devil like that, then someone like Putin, sleepless at night, he finally goes crazy, and he thinks, if I'm going to have to become a separate country, and because everybody's going to not buy my oil, I better have the breadbasket. So I think there are climate reasons and rational actor reasons to explain this invasion, even though it is still a stupid, crazy error, and it's going to bite him.
Well,
but it's going to bite all the rest of us too.
Well, we finally found something we disagree on, because I think that what you're talking about is short-term, extremely important, but long-term, it's going to have to do with the mythology of the children of the owners of the petrostates. If they are the kinds of people who read your books, I think that they're going to transcend the dichotomy you're talking about. But we have a whole lot of people.
We do. We have so many questions. It's such a good conversation. And Stan, I want to say, I have heard your challenge and I accept it.
Great. And I want to say something. We won't have time to answer all questions in the time we have left. But I want to say, if you would transcribe the chat questions and send them to me by email, I will answer them all in a velocity exercise. That's another Fred Pohl term. A few sentences, because I don't like to leave questions unanswered if people take the trouble of asking them.
Sounds
So
good.
I will answer them, and you can get the answers back out to everybody in a delayed response.
That is very generous of you. Thank you for
I like
doing
it.
that.
Yeah.
The other
Better
thing
man than I am.
The other thing I was going to say is we have immediately after this a social hour. So we have a happy hour, a Zoom happy hour, and I think we should dedicate at least a part of that time to continuing answering your question.
I'm
not saying you have to be there. I'm just saying
out, but everybody
I'm
else
just
should,
saying
yes.
we will do that.
Okay, good.
Okay, so questions for you. Mark asks, what kind of interruptus would it take to help or force China to stop building coal plants now?
Oh man. Well, Mark has been good on this. China is unconstrained because of their power in the world, of multiple kinds of power, people, nuclear, financial, resource, etc. As I wrote in Red Moon, I still hope for a G2 in which the USA and China recognize that they are conjoined twins and they can arm wrestle for control and kill each other if they want, but the world only goes well if there is some kind of China-USA détente. So I think full engagement across the board and full awareness that some of them might not be in good faith. Look for the good faith actors within say there's 250 engineers running China, that it isn't just Xi, that Xi is running a delicate balance to try to ride herd, and it could easily turn on him, that this is a shaky, the small group of people at the top, that group of 25 to 250 at the top, if they're not well pleased, then things change fast there.
Yeah.
They're capable of rapid response to a changing situation. And I think it's been good that you've been hard on their heels for their illegal and miscreant actions, their intellectual thefts, etc. But also that at a certain point, you have to admit this is your conjoined twin that you're dealing with here, and you've got to somehow make them behave. And so it becomes rhetoric, art of persuasion, but a rhetoric of actions. What and there's not a good rhetoric of actions the way the ancient Greek handbook of rhetoric is good on words. There's not a good rhetoric of actions. So I think it's an open question and a harder than hell question.
Well, the rhetoric or polemic that I think is absolutely necessary is to make clear that across 3,000 years of glorious Chinese history, they only ever had one friend, who's innocent of colonialism, at least as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
Look up a guy named Anson Burlingame. They only across 3,000 years had one friend who came to their aid 5 times and uplifted them out of poverty. And we don't have to get paid for that. We don't have to get credit for that. But we do want to not be hated, because that's the truth. We were their only friend.
It's worth, yeah, it's worth emphasizing that. But I will say that they are so China-centric that it will be like the rest of us are somewhat ghosts in their own internal story. So,
Right.
but nevertheless, that's an ongoing discussion that we'll get to another question.
All right, so the next question comes from Jolene Anderson, who, as far as I know, is not related to me, actually. Jolene, are you there? You want to unmute?
Yes. And I am not a relative, but a fan. So my question is really more of a comment. I truly believe the only thing we all have in common is the future generation. I truly believe that the only hope is our youth driving this movement forward. They will inherit our mess. So amen to all the youth that are, keeping it in front of the people that don't want to see it.
But you also had a question to me, at least, which was, what is the bridge to open a non-confrontational open dialogue between the oil industry, private enterprise, and governments to imagine a different future, which I think is a very good question.
I personally think we ought to nationalize the oil companies to the extent that we can by taxing them into compliance with our wishes. This is, again, a kind of Keynesian World War II taking over of private industry for public purpose. The public good is served by decommissioning these people, but we need their energy. So again, a kind of an exit ramp made of pressure and taking over, making the decisions. The oil industry could be put to other useful technological purposes, clean energy, their capital, and also sucking this water out from under the glaciers of Antarctica. It uses their own expertise already, but enormous pressure. And as I say, these are small companies compared to the other petrostates, which, being sovereign, we have nowhere near the same kind of leverage over them as we do over private corporations, which as big as they are, there is nothing compared to the national governments that could control their actions. I have no patience for the oil industry. They've done a lot of lying. And it would be nice to just nationalize their ass and put those people to work doing good things.
I like that. Okay, next question comes from Brad Holt, who has a question for you about growth. Brad? He says, our systems have evolved to adapt for and foster growth. Growth has limits. How do we revise or re-evolve our systems to counter growth?
No, let's not say counter growth. No. In fact, to say degrowth, here the rhetoric is wrong. The growth has to be in sophistication, in biodiversity, and in a growth in our actual, how can I say this? In our actual fittedness of 8 to 10 billion people in our biosphere, so that both are prospering. That could be a growth industry. And so growth is of course, it can be a cancer. You could say, well, it's not so good if it's a cancer. But in general, the word grow as a verb is such a positive thing, so indicative of life, that to say, well, we need to do degrowth economics or whatever.
I didn't say degrowth economics. What I said was that for instance, a company can only grow to be so big, and at some point in time, things happen. And so how do we design or evolve systems so that there is an appropriate upper limit for things that need appropriate upper limits, and that other things drive them?
I get you. Well, taxes, tax policy. You simply have a progressive tax, not only the more you make, the more you pay. The bigger you are, the more you pay. And somewhat the French system of you pay a percentage of your assets as a company as a fixed thing. So it's asset taxes as well as income taxes. And at that point, you could tax the hell out of you could be antitrust and anti-monopoly, because the lawyers would immediately say to the biggest companies, if you were 10 little companies, you'd all still be team members, but you would have some semi-autonomy and you'd be paying lower taxes, and boom, you could tax them out of existence. Taxes are stupendously powerful, and essentially a power of the public over the private. It's how the state began, was as a system of taxation in the early agricultural states. And when taxes were progressive and powerful, the French call it the Trente Glorieuses, the post-war period. I mean, in the United States, we had a 93% tax rate on personal income when your income went over 400,000, which would be like 4 million now. And this was Eisenhower and a Republican Congress. So I call for progressive taxation as coming back big and strong to create social policy in a legal way that has already got established mechanisms that people believe in it. They might not like it, but they believe in it. And you can tweak the world by way of smart taxation.
And as you know, Stan, I also believe that transparency comes before the taxation, because there is so much illicit wealth that is not taxed. A universal, you must, if you want to say you own something, you must say that's mine and declare it and put it on the tax rolls. If such a treaty existed, it would probably instantly erase national debts.
Well, I hate tax havens, and I'm thinking also that I wonder if all money is already digital, without getting into blockchain, which is a nasty zone I don't want to go into. Cryptography and digital money in combination would say that all money is now numbers. Couldn't they be tracked? Now, this is a statist thing to say. It's like, oh my God, Big Brother. You mean our governments know where everybody's money is? Well, you know what? It's almost true already. You're supposed to declare it. What if they really knew and then you got taxed accordingly? If there were no tax havens, that would be a great thing. So I will say this, that I've become quite the statist. I don't believe in the anarchist dream. I don't believe in libertarians. I don't believe in free markets. I don't believe in any of that. I believe in the state being democratically elected, that we have good political representation, that our representatives go out there and pushed by us from below, go in the right direction for public policy.
The other option is that money is a technology, right? In the past, historically, there have been different forms of money. Sometimes over time, that money loses value, therefore creating an incentive to reinvest that money back into the economy. So
there have been, there's negative interest rates and all that kind of good stuff. I would say, again, this is a statist response. I don't believe in cryptocurrencies. I think Bitcoin is the tulips of our time. It's a speculative bubble. It's for people who have too much money that are willing to gamble a little. I don't believe in it. It doesn't work as money's supposed to work. It's not a medium of exchange. It's not a storage of value. It's not a sign of social trust. And so it's kind of a thing for drug dealers or whatnot, or speculators. But fiat currency could be digital and tracked and be trusted by people because it's states that are doing it.
I'm going to take a privilege here and ask Kim Stanley Robinson what he's working on now, and why hasn't Hollywood come pounding down your door?
Well, to answer the last first, anonymous content, a very good studio has got Ministry for the Future. We'll see what happens. It means nothing, and unlike you, I've never had anything turned to the screen, and I'm not holding my breath. Might not happen. God knows why. But when you have your heroes are bureaucrats talking about carbon coins, when you think about the movie possibilities for explosions, it's a little, and maybe it's self-explanatory why I haven't had movies made of my books. But to go back to the other part, I have just finished a book that will come out on May 10th. So I actually finished it a little while ago, called The High Sierra, A Love Story. And this is very close to my heart, as you can tell by the title. I've spent a couple of years of my life wandering in the High Sierra. I wanted to write about it. I figured out a way to do it. It's nonfiction. It's memoir, history, geology, natural history in a melange of approaches. and with photographs and maps, and also someone who may have already been to fire, Will Marshall and the people at Planet Labs
Labs, yeah.
Incorporated.
Yep.
Well, Planet Labs provided oblique satellite photos of the high Sierras that are gonna knock your socks off. The Sierras have never looked so beautiful as these views from space at a 60-degree off angle. So that book will come out May 10th from Little Brown. And aside from that, I'm just the paper cutout that looks like a minister for the future. That's pretty much my permanent job now. And God damn it, I do not want to do like David and go on the lecture circuit and stop writing novels. And David, you've got to write a novel, but I'm going to wait a little while.
I've been mentoring dozens of young writers in a couple of YA series.
Everything's than actually writing the damn novel. So
yeah, you and my wife. All right.
All right, we are out of time, unfortunately. Stan, I'm sure we could talk to
Fortunately.
you for hours and hours.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time and your
Pleasure.
energy. And David, thank you for 2 incredible back-to-back interviews.
Yes, and may I want to thank Mark Anderson and the whole Anderson family. Mark, I keep getting the fires. I keep getting educated. I'll see you guys live next time you do it live, and I'm invited.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
So,
You're
All
always
right.
invited.
Bless you all. I'm out of
Sure.
here. Yeah. Bye-bye.